Despite all the turmoil and uncertainty, the U.S. economy just rebounded and is still strong. This morning, the U.S. government reported the GDP increased 3% in the second quarter of 2025. But if you look under the hood, there may be some trouble ahead. So just so we're clear, the gross domestic product, GDP, measures the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during a single year. The GDP is a very important gauge for determining a country's prosperity, strength, and standing in the world. The U.S., by the way, has the largest GDP of any country in the world by far. The second quarter reflects the months of April, May, and June of 2025. And you should also know this is the advance estimate, meaning these GDP numbers could be revised either up or down in the coming weeks. So let's start with the context, because it's super important for you to understand what this 3% GDP in the second quarter actually means. Here is a chart of the GDP over the last 2 years. You can see right there is that 3% increase we saw in the second quarter of 2025. Now, that is a solid number, but it is certainly not the highest number we've seen in the last few years. The highest number we saw was right here in the third quarter of 2023, when we saw the GDP increase by 4.4%. So this 3% number is really sort of on par with what we were looking at in 2024. Now, I want to call your attention to this thing right here. This was the first quarter of this year. This was a contraction of the GDP by negative 0.5%. And that is significant because this is the first contraction that we've seen in the GDP in 3 years. And what's interesting about it is the reason why we saw this contraction is related to the reason why we're seeing the increase this quarter: President Trump's tariffs. According to the government, both the 0.5% contraction in the first quarter of this year and this new second quarter 3% increase were results of imports. See, imports are a factor calculated into the GDP number. When imports are high, that negatively impacts the GDP number, and when imports are low, that positively impacts the GDP numbers. And think about what was happening in the first quarter of this year, January, February, and March. American importers were shipping in truckloads and shiploads of imports to get ahead of President Trump's tariffs, which led to that first quarter contraction. And then in this second quarter, because of the tariffs, American importers really cut back on those imports. The report says imports in the second quarter plunged more than 30% compared to the first quarter. Now, let's talk about the flashing warning light that economists and the Federal Reserve are paying very close attention to. According to this GDP report, when you look at how actual American consumers are spending and the investment being made by private companies, in the second quarter of 2025, the U.S. economy increased only a modest 1.2%. That is the weakest number we've seen since the end of 2022. In the first quarter, that number was 1.9%. And in the fourth quarter of 2024, that number was 2.9%. So you can see the number is showing the economy is slowing down. Now,